You're listening to Spiritual Matters with Energy.
Now, we've interviewed many enlightened spiritual teachers on this program, and if you've ever wondered how enlightenment comes about, you do well to read the book Out of the Darkness from Turmoil to Transformation. We're joined now by the author of that very book, Steve Taylor. Evening, Steve.
Hi there.
Now, this book of yours is focusing very much on how great trauma or negativity in one's life can lead to a spiritual awakening. Can you summarize for us why this intense suffering can become such a gift?
Well, the important factor is letting go or surrendering to your suffering. We all go through intense suffering in our lives at some stage, but the people who undergo transformation are the people who they reach a point where they find that they can't continue. Either they reach the point of complete rock bottom where everything is taken away. There's no place left for them to go. There's no energy. They have no energy left to fight. So they just reach a point where they surrender, where they let go. And usually it's at that point of letting go when they cease to resist their suffering. That's the point where transformation occurs. And I think the reason why this transformation can occur is because when we undergo intense suffering in our lives, it's usually because a lot of the psychological attachments which we build up throughout our lives, a lot of the roles and the labels that we attach to ourselves, when we undergo suffering, these are slowly taken away from us, they slowly dissolve away, or they can disappear quite suddenly in a dramatic, shocking event. So at that point, we're released from all these attachments and these labels and roles. Therefore, we're in a potential state of liberation. But as I say, there has to be an attitude of acceptance or surrendering for this transformation to take place.
So it's kind of, you lose your job, your wife's left you, you have to move out your apartment, everything comes together. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, there's a sort of sense of real peace, even though it feels like everything's kind of falling down around you.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a dramatic and sudden turnaround. You know, you can move from a state of intense turmoil, the most intense state of turmoil where you want to kill yourself, when you really feel as though you have absolutely nothing left, where you've lost everything, you're completely destitute. There can be a sudden and dramatic turnaround into a state which is almost the polar opposite of that, a state of great peace and liberation. When you were talking about Eckhart Tolle before, and I interviewed him for my book, and he described how, he was in this suicidal state. He'd reached a point where he felt as though he couldn't continue in a state of anxiety and depression. And just when he was on the point of close to killing himself, something shifted inside him. His old identity, his sort of ego-based identity, faded away and completely caved in. And that left a space for a new self to be born inside him. So it's almost as if the old self dissolves away completely, and it leaves a vacuum, and a higher self, which is somehow latent inside us, forms and arises into that vacuum, if you like.
So what about for people that are listening in that maybe haven't reached that point in their life where it's completely fallen apart, but they're not sort of too happy? I mean, do we need to experience such turmoil and trauma for this spiritual awakening?
Well, it does seem to be the main factor in a sudden and dramatic spiritual awakening. I mean, obviously, if you practice meditation or yoga or other kinds of spiritual practice, if you practice service or mindfulness, then slowly you can undergo a very gradual, incremental form of spiritual development. But usually, for a dramatic awakening into enlightenment to occur, in most cases, in my experience, in my research, it does require this, breakdown, this sort of breakdown of the old self. But having said that, I think even if we undergo a relatively moderate form of suffering or turmoil in our lives, there are still benefits we can gain from it if we approach it with an attitude of acceptance.
And this is very much what Eckhart Tolle is saying, just about allowing things to be can lead you to that place.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one because, for example, I spoke to a lot of people who had been diagnosed with cancer, and that is a potentially very awakening state to be in, precisely because it destroys all your attachments. If you are diagnosed with cancer, then potentially you're being told that you're going to die within a certain amount of time. And with the shadow of death hanging over you, then all of the things you've built up in your life are potentially close to being taken away. And all of your achievements, all of the status you've built up, all of the knowledge you've built up, the possessions you've accumulated, everything is threatened with being taken away. So again, it takes you into that state of potential liberation, potential enlightenment. But also, the problem is that, if you are diagnosed with a disease like cancer, that a part of you wants to resist it. Obviously, you want to survive, you want to struggle against it, you want to live for as long as you can. But I think if you approach that struggle in a very rigid kind of way, in a very narrow, focused kind of way, if you treat the cancer as an enemy which you have to sort of beat down and fight against, then that will probably block the transformational power or transformational potential of the condition. So yeah, it's probably a question of finding a balance between accepting your predicament and at the same time, not completely giving up. Obviously, you need to survive, so you need to fight against it in the sense of wanting to continue to survive. So it's a question of finding the right balance. When a friend of mine was a counsellor at a cancer hospital here in Manchester where I live, and he told me that he always recognised the people who were resisting the condition, the people who were rigidly fighting against it. They were usually the people who wouldn't accept what was happening to them. They kind of ignored the reality of their condition to some extent. And they were usually the people in very controlling professions, like people like solicitors, head teachers, people who are, had a certain degree of power. So on the one hand, they found it difficult to accept what was happening to them, and they were rigidly determined to fight against what was happening too. And in his experience, they were usually the people who had the worst prognosis, who didn't survive the longest. In his experience, the people who survived the longest were the people who accepted what was happening to them. And, obviously they underwent certain practices, visualizations, therapies to try to survive. But they had an open, accepting attitude to what was happening to them.
I'm interested to understand why it is that some people are actually transformed by the suffering, or perhaps, as you say, news of cancer and so on, while others sort of move deeper into negativity and resistance. Mm-hmm. What's your understanding of that?
Well, I found that women were more likely to undergo this transformation than men. I mean, Eckhart Tolle mentioned this as well, that he believes that women are slightly more open to awakening than men because women's egos are less rigid than men. They're slightly more, the boundaries are less hard. There's a sort of softer ego boundary with women. So I think that's maybe the reason why women are more open to transformation. I think the male ego can be quite rigid and quite controlling, and therefore it's not so willing to let go. So I think an attitude of acceptance, the kind of people who are less determined to control their own lives, the kind of people who are more willing to let go and go with the flow where life will take them, they seem to be more likely to undergo the transformation, precisely because they're more willing to surrender, to accept their predicament.
That was something you spoke about in the book, about people having gone through this transformational shift, no longer feeling the need to try and control their lives, rather than to kind of be there and witness the flow. Yeah,
that's right. I think that's true of anybody who becomes spiritually developed or who becomes enlightened. They no longer feel that they no longer have a strong need to direct the course of their lives, to control the events of their lives. They're willing to stand back and, as if they're in a river, they'll go where the river takes them. They don't want to direct the course of the river. They're happy just to let the river take them where it will. And as a result, that they don't have this sense of separation. Often we feel this sense of separation from our lives. We want to direct the events of our lives because somehow we feel outside our experience. But if you're truly one with your experience, then you no longer feel the need to direct it. You are one with the flow of your experience.
And it's a lot nicer place to be, huh?
Yeah.
Now, another factor that was common to many of the people that you featured in the book was certain distancing from family and friends at the time of this transformation. Can you expand a little on why that happens?
Yeah. A lot of the people I spoke to, they didn't really understand what happened to them themselves. They underwent this dramatic transformation, but a lot of them had no background in spirituality or even psychology. They were fairly normal, in inverted commas, people with normal professions, often quite materialistic people who were not particularly interested in spirituality or self-development. So they underwent this shift as a result of intense turmoil, and they knew that they had this sense of well-being. They knew that something drastic had changed, and they felt this sense of peace and openness. But they couldn't explain it. They didn't know why. And if they tried to explain it to the people around them, obviously the people around them didn't understand it either. So they faced a lot of incomprehension. And some of them, after a while, they actually started to doubt what happened. They thought, am I going a bit crazy? What's happened to me? Why am I different from other people? Why am I different from how I was before? So yeah, they did generally face a lot of incomprehension. But what happened was that slowly, over sometimes months, sometimes years, they gravitated towards spiritual books, other spiritually developed people, and they eventually began to understand what happened and to integrate it into their own lives. But still, they did continue to face incomprehension from the people around them, their previous friends, their family. But usually they gravitate towards other people, people who share their spiritual interests, or the people who practice spiritual pursuits. So they gain new relationships.
It's often said, Steve, that the spiritual path is a lonely one. Do you believe that to be true?
I don't think so, no. Because as you become spiritually developed, you lose the sense of separation, both from other people and from the world around you. So that, you can definitely face incomprehension from the people around you. Obviously, if they remain in the same state and you become spiritually developed, then there's a gulf which opens up. And in some of the people I spoke to, it did affect their marital relationships. Some of them separated from their partners because their partners thought they'd gone a bit crazy. So that a gulf can open up. But I think that once you lose that sense of separation, then you no longer feel lonely. Even if you are alone, you still experience yourself in a state of connectedness to all experience around you, to the world around you. So, even if you're in solitude, there's no loneliness.
But it seemed apparent that a lot of the people that you wrote about, actually after the transformation, wanted to spend more time on their own. They didn't feel the need to have, not just they didn't feel the need, but they actually really enjoyed spending a lot of time on their own.
Yeah, I think that's one of the major outward differences between the awakened state and the normal state of consciousness which most people exist in. In the normal state of consciousness, there's a quite strong drive to be busy, to be in the company of other people. There's normally a resistance to doing nothing, to being alone, usually because in the normal states, when we're alone or when we're inactive, then we face the discord of our own minds, the sort of endless chattering of our thoughts and the sense of isolation which exists in the normal state of consciousness. But once we undergo awakening and we lose that sense of separation, and also people's minds usually become a lot quieter too. They become free of the normal negative mind chatter which fills our minds a lot of the time. So they become free of that, and therefore they didn't feel any resistance to being alone. In fact, it becomes a great pleasure to be alone, because when you're on your own, you can experience the stillness of your own being. You can slowly let yourself merge into that stillness, and you can experience that state of connectedness to the world around you, and you can take in the beauty and distance of all your surroundings. So yeah, that's true. Yeah, a lot of people did become very attracted to solitude. Steve,
why were you drawn to studying and wanting to write about this phenomenon?
Well, it was partly the result of an experience I had myself a few years ago. I became, quite out of the blue, quite seriously ill with, it was a condition called a quinsy, which is quite a sort of old-fashioned illness from the Middle Ages, but for some reason I happened to get it, and I was in hospital for about 3 weeks. I picked up a bacterial infection in hospital, so I became very weak and very ill. I was basically bedbound for 3 weeks, and it was a struggle to walk or to eat or drink. But even over the first week or so, I felt very depressed because it was actually Christmas, so I wanted to spend Christmas with my young children and my wife, but I wasn't able to. I was stuck in a hospital in a miserable ward. But after the first week or so, I actually began to feel a strange sense of liberation and freedom, even though I was physically very ill. I felt this marvelous sense of well-being that was quite difficult to explain. I felt liberated somehow from all my normal concerns and responsibilities, all the normal stuff that goes, the sense of the activities we need to do, the tasks we need to complete. I was free from all of that. And I did feel this marvelous sense of liberation and detachment, almost as if I'd made contact with a deep reservoir of well-being inside myself. And that continued after I got better. And also, once I got better, I felt an incredible sense of appreciation from my body. I felt amazed that my body had returned to its healthy condition. And I was really appreciative of all the tiny processes which take place in my body to keep me alive. So I felt this marvelous sense of appreciation and well-being, which continued for weeks and months afterwards. So that made me aware of the paradox that, in a state of suffering, you can experience this state of well-being. And then I started to write my previous book, which is called Waking from Sleep. I collected a lot of examples of spiritual experiences from people, moments of intense well-being and sense of meaning and connection to the world or the universe. And I found that a lot of these temporary spiritual experiences were also caused by experiences of suffering. People who were in a state of depression would suddenly undergo this shift into a temporary state of great well-being and freedom. So that made me aware of the connection between suffering and spiritual experience. And then I began to find that a lot of the people who'd undergone this spiritual experience after some degree of suffering in their lives, they never shifted back. They remained in a permanently spiritual state. So whereas a lot of the experiences I collected in Waking from Sleep were temporary experiences from people who'd been meditating or who were in the countryside or after sex or people who were playing music, they underwent this temporary state of well-being. I found that these states of suffering can cause a permanent shift into enlightenment.
You're listening to an interview from spiritualmatters.org.
I was most fascinated by your stories of astronauts experiencing what's termed as moon consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
In the book. Can you explain what moon consciousness is and how it was affecting these guys?
Yeah. Well, towards the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s, a number of American astronauts traveled to the moon. I think it was around 12. And practically all of them underwent a profound spiritual experience while they were in space or while they were actually on the moon. For example, one of them, he was looking out of the window of his spaceship at the moon's surface. And it just suddenly struck him that there was nothing random in the universe, that everything was significant and meaningful and nothing was accidental. And another one was, he was looking out of his window on the way back to Earth and had a similar sense that everything was one, that the whole universe existed in unity, that every atom, every planet, every particle of matter in the universe was united together in this amazing oneness. And other people were just amazed, and on a slightly less mystical level, they were just amazed at the beauty of the Earth in space and how fragile and tiny the Earth seemed. So to some degree, they all underwent this powerful shift. And to the extent that a lot of them, when they returned to Earth, they made real changes to their lives. Two of them interpreted their mystical consciousness in conventionally religious terms, and they became born-again Christians and evangelists for the rest of their lives. And a couple of others started meditating and started living lives of service. One of them started to work do voluntary work in a youth hostel. Another one started writing poetry, spiritual poetry, and another one founded an institute for the investigation of that was Edgar Mitchell, who's quite famous. He founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences to investigate spiritual and psychical phenomena. So in a very powerful way, they were all changed they all had major spiritual experiences by traveling to the moon.
I can see why that would be, but what's your take on what it is that looking back at our planet, seeing a sort of ball in space and being outside of it and looking and seeing that that's where everything you know exists? What's that about?
Well, I think on one level, the astronauts stopped taking anything for granted. One of them remarked that when he returned to Earth, it just felt like a miracle to be able to eat, to be able to drink. He was just amazed. He lived in this state of wonder for weeks afterwards, amazed at the miracle of being alive on this planet. And for others, it was a sense that, how incredibly precious and fragile the Earth is, seeing it from space. Several of them became interested in environmental activities afterwards, precisely because they saw the Earth, how fragile and beautiful the Earth was in the emptiness of space. But I think to see the whole universe like that, spread out around you with the Earth at the center of your vision, I think it was a powerful source of mystical experience. It created this mystical consciousness which underwent a shift, which caused a shift inside them. One of the astronauts said that ever since he's been back on the Earth, 40 years later, he's never complained about the weather because he's just glad that there is weather. So yeah, it definitely gives you a sense of perspective. I mean, I use it as an example in the book because I compare it to encountering death. Because encountering death can have a very similar effect. Once you encounter death in quite a profound and direct way, then it does change your sense of perspective. You're much less affected by trivial worries. You have a sense of what's really important in life. You often have a sense of mission too. And all the trivial stuff which normally occupies our minds just doesn't seem important anymore. So there's obviously a powerful and very wide sense of perspective.
So there's a lot to be said for sort of becoming aware of death, because it seems that that's what really can help people to connect and to awaken. Yeah,
I think so. That's the thing about encountering death through cancer. When you're diagnosed with cancer, it can be effectively or potentially a death sentence. So being aware of death, living with the spectre of death hanging over you, can have a massive transformative effect. On the one hand, as the astronauts experienced, it gives you a sense of appreciation. You no longer take life for granted. Even if there is life after death, it's still not going to be life in this form, so there's still a temporariness to this life. And therefore it is incredibly precious, and it's beautiful, and it's precious, and we should never take it for granted. But also, as I mentioned before, death dissolves most of our attachments. The future ceases to be important. Everything that we're striving for is no longer of any significance, so we stop striving, and all our materialistic pursuits, all our possessions, all the status we've built up, all the knowledge we've built up, none of that ceases to have any significance, so we can just let it go. We can just let it fade away. And once we do that, we become free. We've let go of our attachments, and we become, our self has become naked, which is why it can be painful to face the nakedness of the self. But as I said, if you accept it, if you surrender to it, then it allows a space, it creates a space for a new self to be born, for this latent higher self to emerge and become our normal self.
You're listening to Spiritual Matters with Energy, and we're in conversation with spiritual author Steve Taylor this evening. Steve, there was some other fascinating research in the book that looked at people that had attempted suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. They interviewed, I think, 7 out of 10 people that had jumped, and they all claimed to have had a spiritual experience during or after the fall. Mm-hmm. What do you feel that tells us?
Well, yeah, the people who survived, it was interesting that soon after they jumped, obviously it takes 9 seconds to reach the river, because the Golden Gate Bridge is so high. And in those few seconds, they all realized that they'd made a mistake. They all somehow had a wider sense of perspective and realized that the worries that were making them want to commit suicide were somehow not as important as they realized. It was as if there was a kind of fog of depression over their minds, and somehow the shock of jumping and the shock of knowing that we're going to die it somehow cleared this fog immediately. And they realized that, one of them actually said that he realized as he was jumping, as he was falling, he realized that all the problems he thought he had were fixable. None of them were that serious. And he knew that he'd made a mistake. And in those few seconds, he said that if I survive, I'm going to completely change everything. I'm going to live my life again. I'm going to live my life with value and significance. So I think partly it's the sheer shock of knowing that you're going to die in those few seconds. It really undergoes a shift in your perspectives.
And yet they knew they were going to die before they jumped, or there was a pretty good chance they were going to die.
Yeah, they knew, but there's still a difference between knowing abstractly, conceptually, that you're going to die, and to actually experiencing the reality of death. I mean, we all know, in some sense, that we're going to die. We all know that we're mortal. But I think most of us, most of the time, are not aware of that as a reality. That's the thing about, being told that you only have a certain amount of time to live. It makes you aware of death as a reality. And therefore that can have a major impact.
You spoke about that in the book as well, about the fact that we avoid thinking about the fact that we're going to die. Why is that? I mean, obviously we don't like the thought of it, but why have we become a society? I mean, like in India, they're much more accepting of death.
Yeah, I mean, even in our country, in Victorian times, people were much more accepting of death. People used to carry lockets around with the hair of their deceased loved ones. And some people used to keep little skulls on their desk to remind them that life was short and that death was always there. But yeah, you're right. In the last few decades, we've become a death-denying culture. And death has become a taboo subject. It's become a 5-letter word. And we sort of cloak it in euphemisms like pass away or when something happens. But I think part of the reason for that is probably a reaction to the materialism of our culture. As we become more materialistic, we don't want to face death because it means the end of our materialistic pursuits. It also makes materialism meaningless as well. Obviously, the fact that we're going to die and that we can't take any possessions with us, it takes away the value from living in a materialistic way. And partly we've become so obsessed with the youth as well. We've become such a youth-based culture. And obviously, if you value youth, then you don't value decay and death. So, we've become focused on achievement and materialistic pursuits and youth as well.
Now, you speak in the book about various degrees of awakening, and clearly your subjects were at different points on the awakening scale. But do you believe there's an ultimate level of enlightenment that we reach?
I think so. Yeah, I think there are intemporary experiences of awakening, which I call awakening experiences. There are several different degrees. Obviously, they all merge together, but there's kind of like a continuum from basic or mild awakening experiences to very intense, mystical awakening experiences. And in the same way that there are varying degrees of awakening experiences, there are varying degrees of permanent awakening as well. But I think, there is a point where the continuum finishes, if you like. There is a point where there is the most intense state of enlightenment. And in terms of temporary awakening experiences, the most intense state of awakening is a state when we cease to have any individuality. There is absolutely no separation between us and the rest of reality. And in fact, we become the rest of reality. Our own identity infuses everything in the universe. So in fact, we become the universe. There's a state of complete union with no consciousness of separation. And the same applies to a state of permanent enlightenment too. There's a state of complete oneness with the universe, no sense of separation, and a state of complete unity with everything which exists.
So it doesn't get any better than that.
No, that's the ideal state to be in.
Indeed. Steve, were there any personal highlights for you whilst working on the book?
Yeah, well, it was great to interview Eckhart Tolle, for example, because I'd been a big admirer of his books, and so it was great to speak to him. And also, I met some very inspiring people. One of the most inspiring was a guy called Michael Hutchison, who was an author of books on science and spirituality. But he became very severely disabled. He became paralyzed, practically deprived of all movement in his body. He could move his fingers a little bit and his toes a little bit, but effectively he was paralyzed. And he reached a state of complete depression, complete desolation. He's based in the US and his insurance ran out, so he couldn't get proper treatment anymore. And then all kinds of problems in his personal life. His wife wouldn't let him see his son and things like that. So he completely lost everything. He couldn't write books anymore. He couldn't read anymore. But he underwent this amazing shift. He was in this terrible home for mentally ill people, which had put him in, where people were screaming all day and he wasn't sleeping properly. And the nurses arrived to take him for a shower in his wheelchair. And suddenly at that moment he said, a voice inside his head said, "You've got to let go. Don't resist this anymore." He realized that his situation wasn't going to change. He was stuck in this awful, terrible predicament. And he just had to somehow accept it and let go of his resistance. So he said that to himself, and suddenly at that moment, something massive gave way, and he felt this amazing sort of reservoir of well-being and liberation open up inside him. He felt himself plunge into this amazing state of bliss and well-being. And since then, this was about 10 years ago now, since then he's continued to live in this state of bliss and well-being. And he's recovered some movement in his limbs and his fingers, but he still experiences major pain, especially in his spine. And his doctors have offered to give him a permanent morphine drip in his spine. But he's declined because he says that when he's in the state of bliss, he doesn't feel any pain. Or more strictly speaking, the pain is there. He can sense it, but he doesn't feel it in a negative sense. He doesn't experience the negative side of the pain. He's aware of it as a sensation, but he doesn't actually feel it. So he was an amazingly inspiring person to talk to. And there were a number of people who were very inspiring to speak to.
Any surprises?
Well, one of the surprises was that it was so easy to find these people. At the time, 3 or 4 years ago, when I started to interview the people, I was teaching at a college, and I was teaching counselling students. And one of my students, I'd never really, I thought she was a very friendly and very serene somehow lady, but I had not really spoken to her properly. But at the end of one of the lessons, she said to me, "Sorry about my essays, but they're all over the place because I write a lot of poetry." And I said to her, "Well, how long have you been writing poetry?" She said, "Oh, since I had cancer a couple of years ago." And I started talking to her, and I found that she'd undergone this spiritual shift after being diagnosed with cancer. She'd undergone a massive change of values. She'd sold her business. She'd left her husband, and she started living a life anew. She'd trained to be a counsellor, and she'd undergone this spiritual shift. And also, I found that one of my colleagues at the college had undergone it as well. You know, he was an alcoholic who'd lost everything as a result of his addiction. But again, at that point of reaching rock bottom, he'd undergone this amazing spiritual shift. So that was a surprise that it was so easy to find people, and there were so many of them, quite close to me.
And have you got another book in mind that you're going to write?
Yeah, well, I'm actually, I started a new book about a month ago, and it's connected in a way to my earlier book, The Fall, which was published in 2005. And the idea of The Fall was that human beings are mad, basically. And there was a certain point where we went mad, when we fell into psychological turmoil and disorder. So in my new book, I'm developing that a bit more, and The Fall was quite a historical book with lots of anthropology in it, lots of research into different cultures and different historical eras. But this is more of a psychological book. So I'm working on the idea that most human beings suffer from a fundamental psychological disorder, which I call egomania. So I'm analysing, how that affects us, and most importantly, how we can transcend it and heal our psychological disorder so that we become truly sane.
I have to say, on a personal level, when I read that in The Power of Now, it's the first time I'd heard anyone actually declare that we are pretty much mad.
Yeah.
And it made me think, my God, yeah, we are. It was a real awakener.
Yeah, one of the things I've been doing is reading reports from Native Americans who encountered the European colonists in America, and also other indigenous peoples have encountered European colonists who've conquered them and overtaken their cultures. And a lot of them did believe that we were mad in some way. They saw the way that European people were interested in accumulating possessions and dividing up the land and owning the land. And they didn't understand it. They thought it was a disease. One of them said, I think it was Sitting Bull, said that the love of possession is a disease of the Europeans. And they all thought there was something a bit bonkers about us. And, I think that's true. There's a fundamental restlessness in a lot of people, a fundamental discontent, which makes it very difficult for some people to be inactive, makes them want to continually strive for something outside them, makes them continually seek happiness, but they never stop seeking it because it continually eludes them, because the source of unhappiness is actually inside us rather than outside. So, I think there are a number of ways in which you could consider us insane.
All right, now for people keen to get hold of a copy of Out of the Darkness, From Turmoil to Transformation, where do we send them?
Well, they're very welcome to take a look at my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V. Or Amazon's a good place to buy it. I think it's sold at quite a reasonable price on Amazon. So so either my website or on Amazon.
Fantastic. Well, we hope to maybe get you back on when your new book comes out.
That'd be great.
Thoroughly enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for that energy.
You've been listening to an interview from spiritualmatters.org.